Well, good morning. Before I start, can I just ask for a show of hands? Who here believes that our economic system does need to change radically? And who believes it doesn't, it's basically fine? And who's not quite sure? Okay, so it looks as though I don't really need to give my presentation, but I will anyway. So I'm going to talk about why we need to change our economic system. And in essence, what I'm going to say is extremely simple, that we have to act to change our system because the one we have at the moment isn't working. To the extent that, as Philip said, if we don't change it, by 2050, the world won't be worth living in for most people. That's a pretty serious claim, which I will try to back up in a minute. Secondly, there are no real obstacles to change. We've been convinced that there are no real alternatives to the way we're doing things, and that's simply not true. We're imprisoned not by economic realities, but by economic myths. And thirdly, the sorts of things that we need to change to fix it are not that difficult and they're not that radical, so we should just get on and do it. So let me take each of those points in turn. Firstly, I said that we won't reach 2050 with this form of civilization intact, in effect. Now, if you think of the period from the end of the Second World War up to 2050, that splits very neatly into three 35-year blocks. So from 1945 to 1980, that was the golden age of capitalism. You don't hear the phrase very often now, but in England it was, and in the US it was called the golden age of capitalism at the time. In France it was les Trente Glorieuses. In Germany it was the Wirtschaftswunder. It was a remarkable time. From 1980 to 2015 was the age of market capitalism. And we're just in the early stages of that third age. We don't know what that third age is because we're just in the early stages of it. But so far the signs are a bit ominous. So let's just have a look at those three. First of all, the golden age and market capitalism. So these bars compare the performance of the economy on a variety of different measures in those two periods. Of course, the gold bar represents the golden age, and the blue bar represents the age of market capitalism. And you can see that on all economic measures except for control of inflation, the golden age was a far more successful period. It was more successful in terms of overall economic growth. It was more successful in terms of economic growth per capita, which is what you can think of as the size of the pie. But most particularly, it was much more successful when it came to the experience of ordinary people, median incomes, what the typical person would actually take home, typical household would actually take home. That grew much, much faster in the golden age, especially in the States. We've got the data all the way back for the States. You can see it grew about three times faster in the golden age than it has done since then. And in terms of unemployment, in the US, unemployment in the age of market capitalism has been double, so you're twice as likely not to have a job in the States as you used to be. In this country, you're 3 times as likely not to have a job as you would have been in the golden age. So that's the first two periods. Let's just take a little bit more detailed look at more recent history in the UK. So that orange bar, that's GDP per capita, adjusted for inflation. So that's the size of the pie. And the blue line is real median income. So what you can see is in the period from 97 up to 2010, which was the period when, of course, we had the global financial crisis and the recession that followed it. So it actually wasn't a great period, but nevertheless, we did have growth in both of those two, and very, very roughly, they were both growing together. Since 2010, what we've seen is that the economy has recovered. It's essentially richer now than it's ever been. The pie is bigger than it's ever been. But most people are poorer than they were 10 years ago, actually. And some people are quite a lot poorer than they were 10 years ago. So that's already bad news. And what happens if those trends continue? And remember, an extrapolation is not a forecast, but if you extrapolate, what do you see? Well, today's median earnings are just under 24,000, which isn't actually a lot. It's quite hard to survive on 24,000. If we continue with those trends, post-2010 growth and inequality trends, then that will have fallen to under 20,000. Now, that's quite serious. That means half the population in 2050 would be on less than 20,000 in today's money. That's the kind of world, if we simply extrapolate, that we would be heading forward. But what if we extrapolate on a different set of assumptions? What if we were to say, well, we'll have that lower growth that we've had since 2010, but we'll just fix inequality at today's level. So the pie will grow, and everybody's earnings will grow with it. Well, then it wouldn't fall. It would rise from about 24 to nearly 30,000. That's quite a lot better. What if we went back to those trends, which I said weren't great, but the pre-2010 trends? Then it would rise to 34,000. So actually, perhaps we should be planning for a world where everybody's at least 50% better off by 2050. But that's not where we're heading at the moment. At the moment, we're heading for mass impoverishment. And why is that? Well, essentially, it's because we've been told that there is no alternative. We had to have austerity. Why did we have to have austerity? Because of the dire state of government finances. And as David Cameron said, if there was another way, I would take it. But there is no alternative. And you've probably seen lots of graphs which look a bit like this tiny bit of the graph here, which show that, since this millennium started, we've never had debt at these levels. It's been shooting up. It's out of control. It's deadly. But if you step back from the detail, this is from the Bank of England. They have a data set of 300 years of financial history. This is all available on the website, by the way, if you're interested. Then you see a very different picture. This is 300 years of history. This red line is the average level of debt to GDP over those 300 years. So this ruinously high state of government finances, these debts that, as David Cameron said, when you look at the children you love, do you want to leave them with a legacy of huge debts? Well, those are not huge debts. They're not massively above average. They're not slightly above average. They're not even average. They're still, even today, below average. So why the urgency? Well, it's because, debt is bad. Debt cripples the economy. Well, hang on a minute. Let's look what happened after this. 1820. That's when the Industrial Revolution really took off. One of the most successful periods in our economic history. Debt was far, far higher. It wasn't average then. It was way above average. What about the golden age of capitalism? Well, it started after this. Having high debts is demonstrably not an obstacle to enormous economic success. So why did we have it? Why do we have austerity? Well, part of the reason is that this narrative of unaffordability has proven to be very, very powerful. It resonates with people when people themselves are a little bit short of money and a serious-sounding politician stands up in front of them and says, households around the country are having to tighten their belts, businesses are tightening their belts, it's only fair that government should tighten its belt. It sounds reasonable. And it stops us arguing as well. We just stop questioning it. We see a little graph like this, we hear some effective rhetoric, we internalize this narrative of unaffordability, and we reluctantly accept that, we don't like it, but we just can't afford to keep funding the NHS at the same rate. We just can't afford to keep giving local councils the sort of amount of money they need to provide the services they provide. We just can't afford to save the planet. And that's really very useful in preventing debate and stopping people from looking at the underlying philosophy. And the underlying philosophy is what I've termed market fundamentalism. I didn't create the phrase, but I think it's a good one, so I've adopted it. And a market fundamentalist is like a religious fundamentalist. They believe almost as a religious item of faith, that markets are the best way to allocate resources. And the logic goes very simply from there. If markets are the best way to allocate resources, anything else is less good. In particular, the state is less good. So you don't want valuable goods and services being allocated in a less good way. You don't want healthcare being allocated by the state. The market should allocate healthcare. You don't want education being allocated by the state. The market should allocate it. You don't want investments to protect the environment being allocated by the state. You want the market to do those things. Now, of course, you can see where this is heading. It's heading to a world where many people wouldn't be able to afford healthcare. Nurses, teachers, they wouldn't be able to afford healthcare, schooling for their children. But in the market fundamentalist philosophy, that's their fault. And the reason they can't afford it is because they're actually not adding enough value to society. If they had become a banker or they'd set up an internet unicorn, then they would be able to afford it. So their problem is that they have too little merit. Now, because that sounds so unpalatable, two things may be happening. One of them is you think, well, I think Mark's gone a bit mad here, and nobody really thinks like this. Now, I can assure you, shocking though it is, there are a lot of people who really think like that. And if you read chapter 4 of my book, 99%, you'll see in their own words exactly what they think. And what you'll see is that what I've just given you is an accurate description of a very extreme position. So it really is real. In fact, on the website, you can see quotes from some of these extreme people. And they normally, because it's unpalatable, they normally don't set it out very clearly. There are only two recent books that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are others, but there are only two that I'm aware of where they really have laid it out with startling clarity. One of them is the book by Jacob Rees-Mogg's father, William Rees-Mogg, which is called The Sovereign Individual. And in some ways, it's a brilliant book, but it's deeply, deeply scary. It's a recipe for creating a market fundamentalist world and getting rid of mass democracy, which is a big obstacle to creating that market fundamentalist world. So that's one book, which is, if you want to read it, really quite an eye-opener. And the other one that I am aware of is a book by an American economist called Tyler Cohen. His book's called Average is Over. And the thesis of that really is that if you're an average sort of person and you're hoping that you should be able to have an average sort of life, you can forget it. Average is over. You're either going to be rich or you're going to be poor. Average is over. Pretty dismal stuff. Most of them don't say that. And that's a problem if you're a market fundamentalist, because you have political objectives, but you don't really want to lay them out clearly. So what can you do? How can you become politically powerful? Well, whether by accident or by design, something from their point of view brilliant happened, which was the creation of what I call the Hydra. Now, you remember in Greek mythology, the Hydra was a mythical beast, a many-headed serpent. Each of those heads was deadly. Its venom was deadly, but even its breath actually would kill you. And Hercules was given the task of trying to kill the Hydra. Well, this is what the modern-day Hydra looks like. The heads of the Hydra are things like the climate emergency, the low growth that we've seen since austerity was implemented, homelessness, mass impoverishment, of course, my particular area of interest, rising rates of stress and mental illness, struggling NHS, etc., and many more heads that won't actually fit onto this slide. Those are the heads, and the body consists of this policy of austerity, which we don't question because we know there's no alternative, except that, as I showed, there is an alternative. This is a choice. But the really clever bit about it is that the austerity and the underlying philosophy of market fundamentalism are protected by these economic myths. And while we believe those myths, we reluctantly accept that we're not going to be questioning this, and we allow ourselves to be distracted by the heads. And since, just like the mythological Hydra, each of those heads genuinely is deadly, they attract an enormous amount of time and resource, and a lot of well-meaning people spend their time fighting individual heads, But they don't even see these economic myths. They act like some kind of invisibility cloak that hides the body of the Hydra. So from the point of view of a market fundamentalist, this has been brilliant. And this has enabled them to impose these policies, which are, little by little, nudging us towards that world that they want to see created. But now, if we're aware of the central role of economic myths, suddenly this becomes something that we can deal with. And that brings me on to my third point, which is that actually what we need to do isn't really that difficult. It isn't really that radical. It's 5 fairly simple steps. So the first step is a democratic reset. We haven't got a written constitution in this country. And actually, in the last few months, I have become more worried than I have ever been about that fact. It's really hard to know what are the limits. What can the government get away with? What can it not get away with? How far is it prepared to defy the law? How far is it prepared to pack the courts with people who will change the law or change the interpretation of the law? In particular, there's nothing in British law that says a government can't enact a policy that it knows will be bad for 99% of the population. That can't be right. That's not a ridiculous request. Let's make it illegal to have legislation which is bad for 99% of the population. That's not a radical request. That's something that's maybe so obvious that it should go without saying. But unfortunately, you've seen the numbers that say it's not just that it goes without saying, it's also been going without doing. So we do need that constitutional reform. The second one also, it sounds that it's so obvious it shouldn't need to be said. Let's base policy on facts. Well, it does need to be said because we've been basing policy on myths. When I was researching for the book, I came across dozens and dozens of things that I thought I knew. And when I tried to dig in to find the underlying numbers, I found they're just simply not true. There are so many economic myths, so many things we think we know. The state of government finances is just one of 100, and I've probably tackled 20 or so in the book. Economic myths have been driving an awful lot of policy for the last 40 years in the States, and to a lesser extent here as well. Once you've got those two tackled, then you can actually start to think about, well, what policies would fix things? Now, as I'm sure you all know, policy making is complicated, but at its simplest, there are only 4 types of policy. Every policy either grows the pie or it doesn't grow the pie, and it either shares that pie fairly or it doesn't share it fairly. So you could have a policy which is what I call a captured growth policy, which does grow the pie, but it doesn't share it fairly. The benefits go disproportionately to a small minority of the population. You could have a shared growth policy, which both grows the pie and shares it fairly, so everybody benefits from it. You could have a vulture policy, which doesn't grow the pie, and yet it manages to enrich a tiny minority. So a hard Brexit would be that. We know that there are some hedge funds who will make billions if we have a no-deal Brexit. But most people will be a lot worse off with a no-deal Brexit. That's the vulture policy. And there are balancing policies which don't grow the pie, but you might need them if you have one of these captured growth policies. Very aggressive automation would be a captured growth policy. It'll make some people extremely rich, but it will cost a lot of other people their jobs. You might need, nevertheless, automation might be the right thing to do, as long as you have a balancing policy, and then the two together become like a shared growth policy. But if you just do this, it doesn't make sense for most people. So you've only got those 4 types of policy, and that framework enables a politician, not without work, because policy making remains complicated, but it enables them to look at the portfolio of policies and say, well, what does my manifesto look like? Is my manifesto dominated by shared growth policies, or is it dominated by vulture policies? Actually, there shouldn't be any vulture policies in my manifesto. But if I've got some captured growth policies, I need to be making sure I'm balancing them. And I need enough up here, which are the shared growth policies. So actually, if you have the fact-based approach and you have this democratic reset, you can start to formulate policy for abundance and solidarity, for growing the pie faster and sharing it more fairly. And a big part of that is investing wisely in the future. So those are the shared growth policies. A lot of environmental investments would fit into that category. If the government spent 100 billion over the next few years insulating properly every house in the country, that would be a shared growth policy. If it spent a few billion on R&D for electrification infrastructure for cars, electric cars, etc., that would be a shared growth policy. How am I doing for time?
I don't have a buzzer, but if I did have a buzzer, I might be thinking of pressing it.
Okay, in that case, you get the point. Invest wisely in the future. Finally, ensure clean, competitive markets. To too great an extent, the profit motive encourages businesses to do the wrong things, where they can externalize their costs. They get us to pay for the fact that they're not paying their staff a living wage. We have to pick up the cost of the damage they do to the environment, etc. If you fix that, actually the profit motive becomes an enormously powerful force for good, which at the moment it isn't. It's a kind of mixed force. It's not uniformly bad, but it's not uniformly good. So just before I stop, I should say these things really are urgent. Just as Hercules didn't manage to kill the Hydra either on his own or just by looking at the heads, we won't kill the Hydra either on our own or just by looking at the heads. So we do need your help. Please sign up on this website, 99%-org, and see what you can do to help. Thank you very much.